Abia is a land known for its amazing hills, valleys, and rich forests, and the broad rivers that nourished its people. The soil of Abia was fertile, yielding crops in abundance. Palm trees swayed in the wind, their nuts pressed into oil that traveled across markets and kingdoms. Traders from distant lands came to Abia with salt, beads, and fine cloths, leaving with baskets of yam, cassava, and maize. The people of Abia lived by the rhythm of the earth, guided by tradition, and watched over by the unseen hands of the gods who blessed or punished as they saw fit. In this prosperous land, one name stood out above the rest: Chief Eneka, the farmer whose barns never went empty. Chief Eneka's compound stood like a small village of its own, a great thatched house in the center with smaller huts for his wives, servants, and laborers. He was a man respected not for war, though his arms were strong, nor for politics, though his voice carried weight in the elders' council, but for his mastery of the land. His yams were said to grow as long as a man's leg, and his cocoa yams fed entire families. Eneka's success was no accident. He rose before dawn, prayed to his ancestors, and worked until the sun bent low in the west. The people admired him, not only for his wealth but for his wisdom. To many, he was proof that diligence and humility brought the blessings of the gods. Yet prosperity alone does not shield a man from storms within his own household. Eneka had 2 wives, as was common in Abia. His first wife, Ifeoma, was a woman of calm beauty, graceful in manner, and respected for her quiet strength. His second wife, Eo, was younger, vibrant, and striking in appearance, with a sharp tongue and a heart that desired recognition. From them came 2 sons, Kolu, the firstborn of Ifeoma, and Tosin, the son of Eo. The 2 boys, though born of different mothers, played and worked together as brothers. But as the people of Abia knew, the heart of a woman can often be a river, calm on the surface, yet carrying unseen currents beneath. At first, life in Eneka's compound seemed peaceful. The wives of Eneka carried out their duties with diligence, and the 2 sons, Kolu and Tosin, brought joy to their father's heart. Yet within the walls of the compound, quiet sparks of rivalry began to glow, though few could see them. Ifeoma, as the first wife, carried an honor that tradition had bestowed upon her. Her son Kolu, by custom, was not only the eldest but also the rightful heir to Eneka's wealth and farmlands. To the people of Abia, this was natural law, as clear as the sunrise in the east. But for Eo, the second wife, it was a wound she could not easily heal. Though Eneka loved her, though Tosin was cherished by his father, she could not ignore the truth that hung over her like a shadow: Tosin would always stand behind Kolu. She began to notice the small things. When villagers praised Kolu's strength in the farm, she felt it as an insult to her son. When Ifeoma's calm smile was greeted with respect in the market, she believed it was mockery toward her. Envy crept into her heart slowly, like weeds in a fertile field. The more Kolu grew, the more Eo's heart burned. Kolu's voice, steady and commanding, carried the tone of a future leader. He was brave in the farm, skilled with the hoe and cutlass, and quick to learn the wisdom of his father. Tosin, though bright and cheerful, seemed softer in comparison, always eager to play rather than lead. Eo watched with a growing fear. One day, all that Eneka had would fall into Kolu's hands, and Tosin would live in his shadow. That thought festered in her, turning what might have been love for her co-wife and her co-wife's son into a bitter root of hatred. Still, Ifeoma did not provoke her. Ifeoma treated her kindly, shared the marketplace duties, and never raised her voice. But kindness, when met with envy, often feels like mockery. Eo convinced herself that Ifeoma had conspired with fate to make her son superior, and the more she thought of it, the more she desired to change what tradition had decreed. The seed of rivalry had been planted, and though it was invisible to many, it was growing swiftly in the secret chambers of Eo's heart. Kolu and Tosin grew up like twin branches of the same tree, even though they were born of different mothers. From the time they could walk, their father took them into the farmlands. They rose at dawn, their small feet stepping into the dewy grass, their eyes heavy with sleep but their spirits eager to please. Eneka taught them the ways of the land, how to plant yam mounds high so that they would not sink in heavy rains, how to space cassava stems so their roots would grow thick, and how to read the clouds to know when the rains would come. The boys listened keenly, their laughter echoing across the fields as they walked side by side. Kolu, the elder, often took the lead. He had his father's strong arms and quiet determination. Tosin, though younger and less serious, had a warmth that made him beloved by many. He was quick with a smile, quick with a joke, and though he sometimes lagged in the farm work, he always found a way to lift everyone's spirit. The two boys balanced each other like the sun and the moon, different, but together making life in the compound bright. The villagers often marveled at their closeness, for it was not always so among half-brothers. "See how they walk together," the elders would say, like two calves from the same cow. When they returned from the farm, it was the mother's duty to prepare and sell the harvest. Ifeoma, steady as ever, displayed her goods neatly in the market. Eo, with her flair and beauty, drew customers with her lively voice. Together they kept Eneka's market stall thriving, while their sons chased each other between rows of traders, the sound of their laughter mingling with the cries of hawkers selling palm oil, dried fish, and baskets of groundnuts. To onlookers, Eneka's household was a picture of abundance and harmony. But even in their innocence, Kolu and Tosin could sense the undercurrents in their home. At times, Kolu noticed the sharpness in Eo's voice when she spoke of inheritance. Sometimes Tosin felt the tension in his mother's embrace, the way her arms clutched him too tightly, as if she feared he would be taken away. Yet, in their boyish hearts, they brushed it aside. To them, the world was simple, they were brothers, and that was enough. They did not yet know that envy, once sown in secret, can one day demand a harvest of sorrow. As the seasons passed, the boys grew taller and stronger, and so too did the unease in Eo's heart. What began as small flickers of jealousy had become whispers that followed her even in her dreams. Each time she saw Kolu walking proudly beside his father, her mind painted a picture of the future, Kolu inheriting the farmland, Kolu sitting in the elders' council, Kolu becoming the man remembered in Abia. And in that same vision, Tosin was but a shadow, forever second, forever in the background. Eo could not bear it. The gods had decreed the law of inheritance, and tradition upheld it, yet she began to question whether it was fair. "Is Tosin less of a son because I bore him?" she would murmur to herself in the privacy of her hut. Her heart twisted tighter each time villagers praised Kolu. The elders often nodded approvingly at the boy, saying he carried the spirit of leadership. Eneka himself, proud of his firstborn, sometimes placed a heavy hand on Kolu's shoulder in public, a gesture that meant more than words. Each touch was a reminder to Eo that Tosin's place would always be behind. Ifeoma, on her part, remained gracious. She carried herself without arrogance, and when she spoke to Eo, her tone was warm and respectful. But in Eo's eyes, every act of kindness became another insult. When Ifeoma offered her a share of palm oil to sell, Eo told herself it was pity. When Ifeoma greeted her warmly in the market, Eo imagined it was mockery. Envy had sharpened her vision until she no longer saw things as they were but only as her bitterness allowed her to see them. And then the whispers grew louder. They told her that life could be different if only one obstacle were removed. They told her that her son could be the heir, the pride of the household, if Kolu were no more. At first, she tried to silence the thoughts with prayers and sacrifices, but they returned, each time stronger, like the pounding of a drum in the night. Slowly, the whispers shaped themselves into a dark plan, one that would test her love, her conscience, and her very soul. The decision did not come in a single night. For many moons, Eo wrestled with the thoughts that haunted her. She knew the gods frowned upon the shedding of innocent blood, and she feared the judgment of the ancestors. Yet whenever she looked at Tosin, bright-eyed, playful, eager to please, her heart ached with the desire to see him rise above Kolu. She convinced herself it was not hatred but love for her son that drove her restless spirit. If Tosin is denied what he deserves, am I not failing him as a mother? She whispered to herself in the dead of night. But the whispers would not leave her. They followed her to the market, humming in her ears as she bargained for cloth. They echoed in her mind when she watched the two boys return from the farm, Kolu walking proudly like a leader while Tosin trailed behind him. If Kolu lives, Tosin will never rise. If Kolu eats, Tosin will forever be hungry. These were the cruel voices that burrowed deep into her heart, and soon she began to believe them. What had started as envy had grown into something far darker, a plan to change fate itself. The gods had decreed inheritance by the first son, but Eo began to convince herself that even the gods could be outwitted. In her desperation, she visited a wandering herbalist who passed through the village. To him she whispered lies, that she needed protection against snakes in the barn. The old man, weary and greedy, sold her a small calabash filled with a strange, deadly powder. Eo returned home clutching it tightly, her heart pounding at the weight of what she now possessed. She hid it in her heart, yet even as she tried to sleep, the thought of it burned in her mind like fire. One evening, after a long day of farming and trade, the family returned home weary. Ifeoma, as was her custom, cooked a hot meal for Kolu and left it in his room. The great thatch house was alive with the crackling of firewood and the smell of roasted yam, but soon it quieted as night fell. Eo waited until all had gone to rest, then crept out of her hut. Her body trembled, her breath came in short gasps, but her feet moved as if pushed by an unseen hand. She carried the calabash with her, the powder rattling faintly inside. When she stepped into Kolu's room, the oil lamp flickered, casting tall shadows against the red earth walls. For a brief moment, her eyes locked on the boy's sleeping mat, empty for now, and her heart quivered. She thought of Tosin and Kolu playing together, laughing together, as brothers. Doubt struck her like lightning. But envy is a strong chain, and once it binds the heart, it is not easily broken. She bent over the steaming bowl and, with shaky hands, sprinkled the poison. A strange heaviness filled the air, as though the ancestors themselves had entered the room to witness her deed. She froze, staring at what she had done. The food that was once nourishment now carried death. For an instant, guilt threatened to choke her. She considered pouring it away, but another thought rose stronger: this is the only way. This is Tosin's future. With trembling lips, she whispered to herself, "Forgive me, my son, for what I must do for you." Then she turned, slipped quietly out of the room, and disappeared into the shadows of her hut. That night, she lay restless, her eyes wide open, staring into the darkness. Every sound, the cry of a night bird, the rustle of leaves in the wind, made her heart race. She imagined the moment Kolu would eat, the fall that would follow, and the wailing that would shake the compound. Yet she forced herself to believe it was for love, not malice. As sleep finally drifted over her, she did not know that fate had already chosen its own course. The gods had seen her deed, and they had prepared a judgment that no mortal could escape. The night was heavy with silence. The moon hid behind drifting clouds, and the compound lay still, save for the occasional croak of frogs by the riverbank. Eo lay on her mat, her eyes wide open, her breath shallow. She had done what could not be undone. Though she told herself it was for Tosin's future, her heart thumped with fear, as if warning her that she had stirred the anger of unseen spirits. She waited, imagining the moment Kolu would eat the poisoned meal. She pictured his fall, the shock on Ifeoma's face, the sorrow in Eneka's eyes. Her thoughts were dark, but her ambition blinded her from what fate had already decided. At the break of dawn, when the cock crowed to announce the coming day, Tosin wandered into Kolu's room. He was hungry, his body still weary from the long day of farming before. The scent of the food drew him, and in his youthful innocence, he thought nothing of it. Without asking questions, he sat before the bowl and began to eat. He ate quickly, savoring each bite, unaware that death lay hidden within the flavors of his meal. Moments later, his laughter turned into coughing. His face contorted in pain, his small body trembling as if seized by an unseen hand. He clutched his stomach, gasped for air, and then slumped heavily onto the mat. The clay bowl tipped over, spilling its contents onto the floor. By the time his cries reached the ears of those in the compound, Tosin's eyes were already glassy, his chest still. Eo's scream pierced the air like a blade. She ran into the room, her heart shattering at the sight of her only son lying lifeless. She beat her chest, tore at her wrapper, and wailed so loudly that the villagers rushed from their huts to Chief Eneka's compound. Ifeoma, horrified, stood frozen at the doorway, tears already streaming down her face, while Kolu clung to her, terrified. Eneka himself entered, his legs shaking beneath him as he beheld the lifeless body of Tosin, the boy whose laughter had once filled his heart with pride. The compound, once filled with the sounds of industry and joy, had become a place of chaos and grief. Yet within the storm of cries and questions, Eo's mind raced with something darker than sorrow. She knew the truth, that it was her own hand that had cursed the food. But instead of confession, her fear of shame and punishment pushed her toward a path of deceit. With trembling lips, she turned her grief into fury and laid blame where none belonged. Excellent, let's move into the aftermath of Tosin's tragic death. The compound of Chief Eneka shook with cries that morning. Villagers poured in, drawn by Eo's wails that cut through the still air like the cry of a wounded animal. Women clutched their wrappers and men stood with wide eyes as they beheld the lifeless body of Tosin stretched on the mat. His lips were darkened, his body stiff, the remains of poisoned food scattered across the floor. Mothers pulled their children close, shielding their eyes, while elders muttered among themselves, trying to make sense of what had happened. Eo threw herself upon the ground, rolling in the dust, her voice hoarse with grief. But behind her tears lay a fear she could not confess. She knew the hand that had ended Tosin's life was her own, yet she feared the shame and punishment that would follow the truth. In her desperation, her mind searched for escape, and her eyes fell upon Ifeoma, who stood weeping at the doorway. With sudden rage, she leapt to her feet, pointing a trembling finger. "It is her!" Eo shouted, her voice quivering but fierce. "It is Ifeoma. She has long despised me, and now she has killed my only son. The food was hers, prepared by her hand. Jealousy has driven her to this wickedness." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some looked at Ifeoma, their faces filled with disbelief. Others turned to Eo, moved by the passion of her grief. Ifeoma, stunned by the accusation, staggered back as though struck. "No," she cried, her voice breaking. "I would never harm Tosin. He was like my own child." "How can you speak such words, Eo?" Her tears fell freely, but her words seemed powerless against the storm of suspicion that Eo had unleashed. Chief Eneka stood in silence, his great frame trembling, his face drained of color. His eyes darted between his two wives, the accusing one wailing in dust, the accused one broken in tears. His heart was torn in two. Could Ifeoma, the wife he had known for so long, truly have poisoned the child? Or was Eo's grief clouding the truth? The people murmured louder, some demanding justice, others pleading for patience. The compound, once a place of prosperity, had become a battlefield of confusion and sorrow. Eneka, unable to decide, lifted his staff and called for silence. "This matter is greater than my judgment," he declared in a voice strained with sorrow. "We must call the chief priest. Only the gods can reveal the truth of what has happened here." The crowd hushed at his words. For in Abia, when lies and truth wrestled, it was the gods who settled the matter. The people waited, their hearts heavy, as a messenger was sent for the priest, the one who could pierce the veil of deceit and bring hidden things into the light. By midday, the chief priest of Abia arrived at Eneka's compound. The people stepped aside in silence as he entered, his tall frame draped in raffia and white cloth, his staff adorned with cowries, feathers, and charms that clinked softly as he walked. His eyes, sharp and distant, seemed to pierce through the hearts of men. Behind him came attendants carrying a calabash of palm wine, kola nuts, and sacred chalk for the rituals. The atmosphere grew heavy, for everyone knew that the gods could not be deceived. The priest ordered Tosin's body to be laid in the center of the compound. He raised his staff toward the sky and called upon the gods of truth, the spirits of the ancestors, and the earth itself to bear witness. Libations were poured onto the ground, and kola nuts were broken and cast into the dust. The people held their breath as the priest marked his face and staff with chalk, then closed his eyes in solemn silence. For a long moment, the only sounds were the buzzing of flies and the distant cry of a hawk circling above. When the priest finally spoke, his voice was deep and steady, like thunder rolling over distant hills. The gods have spoken. It is not Ifeoma who brought death into this house. His words fell like a hammer, and a murmur swept through the crowd. Ifeoma dropped to her knees, sobbing in relief, while Eo's body stiffened, her wails faltering. The priest turned slowly, his eyes locking on Eo. His voice grew louder, cutting through the murmurs. The hand that mixed death into the boy's food is none other than his mother's. Eo sought to destroy Kolu, but the trap she set for another claimed her own child. Such wickedness cannot be hidden, for the earth itself rejects it. The compound erupted with gasps and cries. Eo collapsed onto the ground, her hands trembling, her mouth struggling for words. No, it cannot be, she stammered, but her tears betrayed her guilt. Some villagers spat in anger, others shook their heads in sorrow. Ifeoma, though vindicated, wept all the more, mourning Tosin's innocent life and the brokenness of the family she had tried to protect. Chief Eneka bowed his head, his shoulders shaking. The truth was heavier than he could bear. He had lost a son, and the mother of that son had poisoned her own womb with envy. His voice, when it came, was deep with grief and finality. The gods have spoken. Eo has brought death and shame upon this household. She cannot remain among the living in Abia. The elders nodded solemnly, for tradition allowed no mercy in such a case. The people began to chant songs of judgment, their voices rising in sorrow and anger. Eo, once a woman admired for her beauty and spirit, was now condemned, her name stained forever by her deed. She was to be sent into the evil forest, the place of banishment where spirits roamed and no one returned. The sun dipped low in the horizon as the sentence was carried out. Eo was bound with ropes of palm fiber, her cries echoing through the village as she was led toward the evil forest. Some covered their ears, unable to bear her wails, while others followed in silence, convinced that justice had been served. Mothers pulled their children closer, warning them never to allow envy to take root in their hearts. Eo's once graceful steps had become stumbling and weak, her eyes swollen from endless tears. When they reached the edge of the forest, the elders released her bonds and pushed her forward. She stumbled into the darkness, her figure swallowed by the thick undergrowth. The villagers turned back, singing dirges that marked the end of her life among men. Back in Eneka's compound, silence lingered heavy in the air. Ifeoma sat with Kolu by her side, her arms wrapped tightly around him as though she feared losing him too. Tears streamed down her face, not just for Tosin, but for Eo, who had fallen victim to her own bitterness. Chief Eneka sat apart, his staff lying uselessly at his side. His heart was a storm of sorrow, guilt, and exhaustion. He had once been the proudest farmer in Abia, a man whose household was envied by many. Now, his prosperity felt hollow. The laughter of his sons was gone, replaced by grief and whispers. Even the birds that often perched on the compound's thatched roof seemed absent, as if mourning with them. The villagers, though satisfied that justice had been served, could not hide their pity for Eneka's broken home. Some came bearing food and words of comfort, others offered help in the farm, but the compound remained heavy with sorrow. Tosin was buried at the edge of the family farmland, under the shade of a great iroko tree. His small grave was covered with clay, and his name was etched into the hearts of all who stood there. Ifeoma wept bitterly as she laid flowers on the mound, while Eneka's silence spoke louder than any tears. That night, as the moon shone pale over Abia, Ifeoma whispered prayers by Tosin's grave. "Forgive her, little one," she murmured, her voice breaking. "Forgive your mother, for envy blinded her eyes." Her words drifted into the wind, mingling with the rustle of leaves. Chief Eneka stood behind her, his tall frame shadowed by the moonlight. He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder but spoke no word. For though Ayo's deed had been punished, the scars it left upon his household would never fade. In the weeks that followed, life in Abia slowly returned to its rhythms. The markets opened, the drums of festivals beat again, and farmers returned to their fields. Yet within Chief Eneka's household, the wound remained fresh. Every time Kolu tilled the soil, he glanced at the iroko tree where his brother lay. Ifeoma moved about with quiet grace, holding her household together, while Eneka's once booming laughter faded into silence, his spirit aged by grief.